All presidents face emergencies, many of them unexpected. Our next guest has studied 2 centuries of disaster management from the Oval Office. That's the subtitle of the book titled, Shall We Wake the President? Its author is Tevi Troy, who joins us now. Thanks for joining us in the program.
Thanks for having me, Mitch. Really excited to be here and talk about disasters and presidents.
So what made you think that this was something worthy of a book, looking at how these presidents over the years have dealt with emergency management and disasters?
Well, Mitch, I worked in the Bush administration, and it seemed to me that the entire administration was shaped by disasters, including 9/11 right at the outset in President Bush's first year, obviously Katrina in the first year of his second term, and then the financial crisis towards the end of his administration. And I noticed the extent to which disasters shaped how presidents approach things, shaped how the White House staff and the entire government approach things, and also helped determine the legacy of presidents. At the same time, these are really important for the American people in terms of knowing that they have someone who's in charge of things and wants to help them get through the disaster. So it occurred to me to look at this question of how other presidents have handled disasters and give the American people and future presidents some advice about how to go about it better in the future.
You had firsthand experience with the Bush administration working on this. As you looked into the history of it, what were some of the things that really leaped out at you as very interesting or surprising?
While working in the administration, I noticed one thing that it seemed as if almost every department got involved in disasters. Agencies that you thought wouldn't have anything to do with a disaster, HUD or labor, they were heavily involved. The second thing is, as I was saying earlier, that it takes the entire White House, it sucks all the energy, and it becomes the focus of everything. And the third thing is that government is really not very good at it, that you have all this money and you spend it on FEMA, and yes, FEMA does come with some aid and supplies eventually, but in those first 24 to 48 hours, if there's a disaster in your area, you are pretty much on your own. It's yourself, your family, your community, and that's what you have to rely on in the initial stage after disaster. And that's why in the book, I have advice for individuals for how to prepare for disaster so that you're not just relying on government.
Let's get to some of that advice in just a bit, but going back to the history of this, were there any particular administrations that leaped out at you as doing an especially good job or such a terrible job that no one should ever emulate them?
Absolutely. And in fact, in the book, in Shall We Wake the President, I have a list of the 5 best and 5 worst presidents at dealing with disasters. And number 1 on my worst list is Woodrow Wilson and his handling of the 1918 flu. When I read about this, I was just shocked. 675,000 Americans died. The average life expectancy of Americans dropped by a decade as a result of this flu. And President Wilson not only did nothing, but he took certain steps that I think made it worse. For example, he was told that the troop transports that were taking American servicemen to Europe to fight in World War I were spreading the disease among American servicemen and among the people of Europe. And so he was warned about this, and he, after a discussion in the White House, decided not to stop those troop transports. He also had a propaganda machine that was trying to highlight happy news and discourage talk of sad things. And so in that sense, they didn't have the dissemination of information about the crisis and what people could do about it.
And how about the best? Who did the best?
Well, I got to say, I give a lot of credit to Bill Clinton for prevention of Y2K. Now, we're not sure if Y2K, which was the thing that happened around the switch from 1999 to 2000, where there was some thought that computers couldn't handle that switch from one millennium to another, but it might have led to a meltdown of our computer systems. And Bill Clinton marshaled state, local, federal resources. He worked with the private sector. He worked with our international partners, and he made sure it didn't happen. So I think preventing a disaster is the best thing a president can do.
Yeah, in fact, those of us who lived through it probably are thinking back and going, oh yeah, Y2K. There was big concern about it at the time and didn't end up being much of a problem at all. We're speaking with Tevi Troy, who is the author of the book, Shall We Wake the President? 2 Centuries of Disaster Management from the Oval Office. As you went through the preparation for this book, did it send you back into the days of working in the Bush White House and saying, I wish we had thought of this, or I'm glad we didn't do this? Were there things that took you back to your White House experience and made you think, okay, well, we did this and another administration did this better or much worse than what we did?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I remember one striking moment along those lines when I was reading about the 1968 race riots in Washington after the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King. And I was looking at pictures, and I saw a picture of Lyndon B. Johnson, who was president at the time, and didn't do a very good job at preventing the riots, which pretty much took place every summer during his presidency. They called them the long, hot summers. And Johnson is in a helicopter flying over downtown Washington, D.C., and looking at the devastation below in Marine One, the president's helicopter. And he looked ineffectually below. And in that picture, he looked eerily like George W. Bush in his infamous flyover over the Katrina area. So the lesson I take from the book is that sometimes it's a good idea for a president to go to a disaster area. Sometimes it's a good idea for a president, because it takes up local resources, not to go to a disaster area. But it's never a good idea to do a flyover.
One of the things that you mentioned a little bit earlier is the fact that your book mentions some advice for individuals so they don't have to rely on government in the times of disaster. What are some of the things you want people to know individually?
Well, first let me just say that I'm not some kind of prepper, and I don't have an underground bunker in my backyard or anything like that. But I do have some food and water in my house just in case. I think people should have some kind of home protection. I'm not going to weigh in on what exactly that should be. I mean, we do have a Second Amendment in this country, but some people want to have other forms of home protection. That's fine. You should have a plan with your family. If, let's say, communication goes out, where can you go and what can you do? Have some cash on hand. There are things you can do to prepare yourselves. There are certain non-perishable items that you can store for the long term. One person in Hollywood told me that he stores a lot of toilet paper in his basement because A, it's something you'll need in a crisis, but B, it's also something that you could barter if things go really wrong.
Very true, because everyone's going to need toilet paper. How about for the government? What are some things that you think governments, the Trump administration or other future administrations, could learn from this book that'll help with the next disaster?
I think the first and number one lesson is that governments/presidents need to think about this. They can't just go blindly and say, oh, yeah, I'll deal with the disaster when it comes. And one thing we did in the Bush administration was tabletop exercises. And those tabletop exercises really helped inform our thinking about how to approach disasters. And they also raised issues that we didn't think of beforehand. So I remember there was one tabletop exercise where we imagined two crises happening at once. And one thing that we didn't anticipate and we were unprepared for was the extent to which the hospitals were swamped, not with sick people, but with what's known as the worried well, people who think they have the disease even if they don't. So I think these kinds of exercises really help introduce the players in government to their colleagues so that they're ready for a disaster, and they also help them think through issues before they become disasters.
Our time remaining is short, but given your experience in the Bush White House, what we saw with 8 years of Barack Obama, now a Trump administration in place, do you have a sense of whether there are people within the federal government who see this issue and are trying to get this in front of the policymakers to make sure that they're paying attention to these things?
It's hard to say for sure because they haven't filled out all of the policy roles. I mean, the top level people aren't necessarily the ones who focus on this. But I do know a couple of things. Number one is that the HHS budget, the Health and Human Services budget, includes funding or a request for funding for better preparation for bioterror attacks. And then the second thing I know is that I serve on a bioterror commission, a blue ribbon panel with Senator Lieberman and former Secretary Ridge that looks at these issues of biopreparedness, and we've made some recommendations that I know have been shared with the administration.